Hello and welcome to another of my Big Picture specials where I take a deep dive into some of my favourite actors, directors and movies, etc. So this week I'm going to concentrate on this wonderful chap, Mr. Oliver Reed. On my radio show last week, I talked about the band The Trogs and their trailblazing track, Wild Thing. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but Oliver Reed performed an infamous version of that song on Wogan whilst being totally drunk. Now, it made the papers. It always did. When Oliver Reed was ever involved in anything, it always made the papers. He was a hellraiser. He was the enfant terrible of the 1960s through the 1970s. But he was also a fantastic actor and appeared in some of the most important films of his era. He was born on the 13th of February 1939 in Wimbledon to his father Peter Reed and his mum Marcia, but he was also the nephew of Sir Carol Reed, a fantastic film director, of course. Now, sadly, it seems that he didn't have a particularly great relationship with his dad. He said that his dad thought he was lazy and called him a dunce. But he was the grandson of an actor-manager called Sir Herbert Beerhometree and his mistress Beatrice May Pinney, who he said was the only woman that ever understood him or took any notice of him, cared for him, kissed him, that sort of thing. So it seems like a very sort of sad upbringing. He also claimed that he was a direct descendant of the Tsar of Russia, Peter the Great. Now, whether there's any truth in this, I couldn't find any information about that. But I think this may well have been a coping mechanism, these kind of flights of fantasy. And it's part of the reason why I think he's got this great acting ability. I think he was left to his own devices a lot as a child. He certainly went through quite a few schools, 14 of them in fact. So that suggests that, there was a lot going on in his life. Once he left school, he tried out quite a few jobs, it seems. He tried to be a boxer, a taxi driver and a hospital porter, amongst other things. But he eventually ended up through national service in the army. And I love this. He said that it really helped him as an actor because most people were great actors. They were in peacetime and there was a lot of these guys telling him about the war, which he found hilarious. Once out of the army, he turned his hand towards acting, but he started out as an extra, actually, appearing in quite a few movies from 1955 onwards, including Norman Wisdom movies and television series like The Invisible Man. But what follows is really rather curious. He has a very up and down career. I mean, for instance, he makes a small break into British TV drama with a BBC series called The Golden Spur, where he played Richard of Gloucester, but it doesn't significantly help him. He actually weirdly disappears into a whole mass of films through 1960 actually, where he appeared in very small things, largely uncredited, including Upstairs and Downstairs, and he plays a bouncer, for instance, in a Hammer film called The Two Faces of Dr. Jekyll. But that relationship with Hammer became a very fertile ground for his development. That film, The Two Faces of Dr. Jekyll, for instance, was directed by Terence Fisher, who gave him his first significant role in another Hammer film called The Sword of Sherwood, which was about the Robin Hood legend, of course. It was to be Terence Fisher who would cast him in his first leading man role. 1961, in fact, The Curse of the Werewolf. And that relationship with Hammer went from strength to strength. They absolutely loved Oliver Reed and put him in quite a few films, including quite a lot of swashbuckling movies they made. I mean, you might not know that Hammer wasn't just a filmmaking company that made horror movies. They made quite a lot of action films as well. And he started with Peter Cushing, for instance. And it very slowly became a really strong fixture of British filmmaking. At the same time that his film career was developing, he was also developing a real name in British television as well, including starring in The Saint and a various number of other big productions at the time. His next major breakthrough was starring in a film called The Party's Over in 1963, which was developed by a chap called Guy Hamilton, who was a very, very hot director at the time. He went on to direct quite a few James Bond movies, actually. Now, what's interesting about that situation is that Guy Hamilton regards Sir Carol Reed, who is, of course, Oliver's uncle, as being his main influence and was one of the reasons why he became a successful and highly regarded film director. So whether there was some kind of nepotism going on there, I don't know. Probably, I would say. Now, 1964 would prove to be a pivotal year for Oliver Reed. He was cast by Michael Winner in a film called The System. That would be the first of 6 films he would make with that film director. But also, what is also significant is that he met Ken Russell. Ken Russell saw him perform in The System and wanted to cast him in his next film called the Debussy film, which was about Claude Debussy. Now, Oliver Reed cites this whole period as the start of everything for him, really. Sadly, he'd been involved in a barroom brawl, which had resulted in being cut and his face very significantly disfigured. And he said that the film industry, the British film industry, was not casting him in anything. I think they regarded him, he certainly says they regarded him as a bit of a cripple. So Ken Russell's belief in Oliver, despite his disfigurement, was everything to Oliver, and quite rightly so. He often talks about that and the fact that up until that point, he'd always ever done villainous roles, and Ken gave him this opportunity to play something a lot more dramatic, a lot more art-based, a lot more sort of like personal, I would say. And he often sort of says that Hammer gave him his start. And that Michael Winner gave him his bread, meaning his money, and Ken Russell gave him his art. From that point on, he kind of flipped between the movies of Michael Winner on the one hand and Ken Russell on the other. Now, he did star in other films in between, but they were the two significant people in his life, and they really seemed to look out for him and really, really like what he did. So the second movie he made with Michael Winner was a very significant comedy film called The Jokers, which also starred Michael Crawford. And then the third film, which came very quickly after that one, was called I'll Never Forget What's His Name, where he co-starred with Orson Welles, no less. But it was to be a film made in 1968 that would send him into the stratosphere. Of course, he stars as Bill Sikes in the wonderful film Oliver, made by his uncle, Sir Carol Reed, of course. Now, I can't think of a more villainous character ever portrayed on the screen. It is really quite something to watch, that tour de force, where Oliver brought all of those, experiences in those films in Hammer and his general wonderful sort of personality to that role. Absolutely incredible, really. And then in 1969, he made another one of my favourite movies, Women in Love, which was again shot by Ken Russell and co-starred Alan Bates. Down through the 70s, he continued to grow his currency, if you like, starring in some very significant films, specifically starring as Athos in both The Three Musketeers and its follow-up, The Four Musketeers. And then he sort of made another Ken Russell film, which I think you guys would all know, the wonderful Tommy, of course, where he starred with Roger Daltrey in the role as Tommy's father. But of course, you can't really talk about Oliver Reed without talking about his lifestyle outside of filmmaking, which, was very debauched. He was a big drinker and a hellraiser and a womanizer. It was all those things that made up those, those characters of that period. And he made some sort of strong relationships. He formed a very close bond with Keith Moon, where they went hell-raising together. And I know through my own experience, I've been co-managed by Bill Curbishley, who managed The Who. Some of the stories that Bill told me about that period are, quite frankly, hair-raising. But that was the time, and that was the period, and that's what they were into. But of course, that sort of lifestyle does eventually catch up on you. So the 70s really did prove to be very fertile ground for Oliver Reed. But when he hit the 1980s, I think largely because of, his behaviour off screen, people were clearly not quite as keen to work with him. But he did star in films. His currency was still pretty high. He was an iconic character even back then, So he starred in a film for Disney, for instance, called Condor Man with Michael Crawford, which I remember going to see at the pictures as a child. And even back then, I can remember thinking it wasn't very good, to be honest. And he kind of disappeared into a whole load of exploitation-based films like Spasms and Two of a Kind and Captive and Black Arrow and all these sorts of movies. And he did consider quitting acting in 1980, around about 1986, until Nicholas Roeg cast him in actually a fantastic film called Castaway, which revitalised his career for a period of time. And this trend continued right through that period. He'd flip-flop between a fantastic film like Castaways, or then he'd go and be involved in a load more exploitation movies. He got involved with a chap who shot a lot of films down in South Africa called Harry Allen Towers, and most of those movies never actually made the screen. They just ended up on straight through video. The next significant role that he got was in this wonderful film, one of my favourite films of all time. Not many people really like it, but I love it. It is, of course, The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, shot by Terry Gilliam. And Oliver Reed stars as Vulcan, the god of war. And I love his performance in this. It's vintage Reed. And I can remember, at the time watching the film when it came out, thinking, oh, that's where he's been. It's you know, he sort of disappeared from view. It was really, really sad. But you know, did a great performance in that that film. You know, and if you don't really know it very well, I would recommend that wholeheartedly. Now, unfortunately for everyone concerned with Munchausen, it was an unmitigated disaster, and a very costly one at that. Which is very sad, because I do think his performance in that film was a big standout for me anyway. So by this point, he's in his early 50s. He's 51, I think, but he still continues to work. You know, I think this is one thing that people forget about the guy, that really his public persona, you know, came before him, really. You know, he was known in the press and on TV as someone who made a fool of himself. I mean, that very famous performance of Wild Thing that I talked about earlier on Wogan, I remember it really, really well. And, you know, it's one of those things that you sort of formed your opinion based on that, not on the talent of the guy, which I think is very sad, because he was working really, really hard. I mean, let's just list a few films that he was making through the back end of the 80s and into the 90s. He made a film called The Lady and the Highwayman in 1989, and then a film with Hugh Grant called The House of Usher, also in 1989. Then he made The Return of the Musketeers in 1990, and then Treasure Island in 1990 as well. And then with Charlton Heston in A Ghost in Monte Carlo, also in 1990, and then another film called Hired to Kill in 1990, and another one called Panama Sugar in 1990. I mean, it goes on, the list goes on and on and on. He was a very hard-working guy, and I think that's how I prefer to remember him, you know, that great work ethic and a fantastic character actor. But of course, it would be remiss of me not to talk about his very final film, which was this, of course, Gladiator, you know, where he starred as the slave dealer Proximo. And this is where my sort of connection to the man, well, the only connection I've got to the man at all, really, apart from, you know, connection through The Who and the fact that we were co-managed by Bill Curbishley, is this film. I mean, I didn't meet him, but I came very close. I was supposed to go to Malta and be involved with the team shooting the stuff which was staged over there in Valletta. But I couldn't make it for one reason or another, so I always sort of kicked myself about that. But it's a very sad story. Unfortunately for Oliver, you know, I think the demons were still there. He had, in fact, cleaned up. He was sober and wasn't drinking. But he got drawn into a drinking competition with a load of military guys in a pub on the island, and sadly that's what killed him. But it has to be said that a lot of praise has to go to Ridley Scott, who clearly saw his performance as central, and I think it really is. When you watch that film, it's a very powerful performance, and that smouldering intensity, that sort of you know, there's just something so significant about the way that Oliver used to bring the roles to life. You know, he absorb himself into that, into the character. And Ridley Scott, you know, famously used body doubles and face replacement and all that, some of the first that were ever done on a film, to make sure that it preserved his performance on the film. And he was nominated for a posthumous BAFTA for that film after the year of his death, which was, of course, 1999. And he died at 61 years old. It's no age at all, is it? But what a career. And I would urge you all, if you don't know much about Oliver Reed and you don't know many of his films, seek them out. So there are some fantastic performances there. The Hammer films from the early years, there's some wonderful stuff going on there. Oliver, check it out. If you might have passed that film over a number of times because it's, you know, I suppose for people of my generation, it was a significant film for kids, but it's a wonderful performance. Women in Love, another fantastic performance, etc. So if you don't know him, check him out. I've always loved Oliver Reed. I love that extreme people. I like the fact that he brought his entire soul to bear on all these films, and the fact he was a fantastically hard-working man. So there we are. That's my tribute to the wonderful Oliver Reed, and I shall be taking another trip with another artist or another filmmaker next week. So check in and let's see what it will be. Take care.